Welcome to Regis World Literature, Lesson 19. This is the third tape for Lesson 19. We've already had French literature and grammar, and this topic is the Count of Monte Cristo. Now, I'm using these tapes to allow myself to address some detail in the book that I frequently am not able to get to when we're only discussing in class. So I would like you to take notes on them. I'm considering this section, part 2, I label it the prisoner. Certainly that's just my arbitrary division. Well, I don't think it's that arbitrary, but and label. But the first thing we realize, of course, is that Dantes is thrown into prison. And at the beginning, he doesn't not resist because he doesn't believe that it's long-term. He has been led to believe by the deputy that this is just for a day or two while they look into this more, and then he will be released and everything will be just fine. In his own words, on page 53, he says, the deputy's words were as, quote, a sweet promise of hope. So he was non-resistant at the beginning. Now, as far as some details, of course, he was thrown into the prison, the Chateau d'If, EAU, castle, is the meaning of the word chateau. And this is for dangerous political prisoners. Now, you are going to have a chance in class to discuss with your fellow students the different emotions and stages he goes through as he tries to adjust to prison life. One beautiful phrase that I just like on page 57, let me go to that, and I just want to, so sometimes this gives me just a chance to show what I consider some of the nicest treasures from a literary standpoint in the book. So I'm not going to trace his development. I'm going to leave that to the students. But if you will go to page 57 in the book, this would be, of course, the Barnes & Noble Classics version here. I'm sorry, this is on page 57, and at the bottom of the page it says this. The prisoner followed his guide, who led him into a subterranean room whose bare and reeking walls seemed as though impregnated with tears. A sort of lamp standing on a stool, the wick swimming in fetid oil, illumined the shiny walls of this terrible abode, and revealed to Dantes the features of his guide and under-gaoler, ill-clad and of a low type. The phrase that I thought was just particularly beautiful from a literary standpoint was that phrase that says, whose bare and reeking walls seemed as though impregnated with tears. And so there's an atmosphere in this jail of despair. And that's beautifully written. The next thing I want to discuss with you is Mercedes or Mercedes, I'll struggle with that, and her, when she goes to plead for Dantes with Villefort. And she confronts him outside his house. If we recall in the chapter that begins on 61, she asks him very direct questions. He's embarrassed by the way he answers them. And then I think this is an important part of understanding the character of Villefort himself. Look on page 63. So he answers her in an embarrassed fashion. And she leaves with despair, and then towards the evening, towards the bottom of the page, it says this. Okay. This is the bottom of page 63. I'm sorry, this is further up. Let's start near the top of the page. It says, embarrassed by the straight look she gave him, as also by her entreaties, he pushed by her and entered his house, locking the door after him, as though to shut out all sadness. But sadness is not banished so easily. Like the wounded hero of Virgil, speaking of Aeneas in the Aeneid, he carried the arrow in his wound. Now, what is that reference? To carry the arrow in your wound. That means you've been injured, right, by an arrow, and the arrowhead is still stuck. So there's a pain, a deep, sharp pain that's always there long after, until that arrow point gets out, long after the initial wound. So like the wounded hero, he carried the arrow in his wound. I think that's a good thing to think about as we watch this book go forward. He had no sooner entered his room than his legs gave way under him. He heaved a deep sigh, which was more like a sob, and sank into his chair. For a moment the man was in doubt. He had often passed sentence of death, but the condemned men who owed their execution to his crushing eloquence had not caused him the slightest compunction, for they had been guilty, or at all events, Villefort had believed them to be so. But if at this moment the fair Mercedes had entered and had said to him, in the name of Almighty God who watches over us and is our judge, give me back my lover, he would have given way, and in spite of the risk to himself, his icy cold hand would have signed the order for Dante's release. But no voice broke the stillness. The door opened only to admit his valet, who came to tell him that his carriage was there. So what we see is one of the initial responses of Villefort is regret. He's a stern judge, in his mind a righteous judge, but this man, he knew, did not deserve to go to prison. And this is going to be something this passage indicates will seep deep into him and plague him. Okay, so that's the reference to the wound. Now the end of this chapter here, 63 and 64, discuss where other people, other main characters are during this time where Dante's is getting used to his prison. The bottom of the page says, Monsieur Morel did not give up hope. He had learnt of Dante's imprisonment and had gone to all his friends and all the influential men of the town. But it was already reported, that Dantes had been arrested as a Bonapartist, and since even the most sanguine looked upon any attempt of Napoleon's to remount the throne as impossible, he met with nothing but coldness, fear, or refusals, and returned home in despair. So Morel is actively trying to seek to help Dantes be released by going to all the men of influence that he thinks he has any sway with, but he meets with nothing but coldness, fear because of the political unrest and danger of the time, and despair, returns in despair. Okay. Let's look at Caderousse. The next paragraph says, he was restless and uneasy, but instead of trying to do something to help Dantes, he had shut himself up in his house with 2 bottles of wine. So here it's interesting because many people here we see have compunction about what they have done. Initially, the heart feels guilt, but if we resist it and push it away, okay, it's going to get hardened over time. So he is restless and uneasy but rather than having the courage to come forth, instead he drowns his conscience in alcohol. And the last one, Danglars, in the next paragraph, Danglars alone felt no pang of remorse or restlessness. He was even happy, for had he not avenged himself on an enemy and assured for himself the position on board the Pharaon he was in danger of losing? He was one of those calculating men who are born with a pen behind his ears and an ink pot in place of a heart. He went to bed at the usual hour and slept peacefully. So there is no pang of remorse or restlessness. So this is illustrating that he, of all these characters, was the most hard-hearted. Now what we have is the 100 days. The 100 days refers to when Napoleon escapes from his exile on the Isle of Elba. I'm sorry, let me write this in. During this time, we realize that Villefort is in a precarious position, but he is protected by his father, who, Noirtier, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, who tries to protect him during this brief season, which is very different from the way the son is acting towards the father. The hymn is Villefort. Right? After the Second Restoration, it's very brief. During the Second Restoration, Morel seeks to again get Dante's release, but once that is over, there's great fear of repercussions, and it quiets him. So Morel ceases to work actively for Dante's anymore. What happens to some of the others? This is after the Second Restoration. I think it's important to trace what happens to these men next. Danglars begins to fear that Edmund would be returned during this time of unrest and Napoleon's second brief rule, and so he flees to Spain. I wouldn't say flees, maybe he gets a job, on another merchant ship that's Spanish and disappears for several years. Goes to Spain. And you'll if you don't remember, you'll find this part of the story on page 76. In addition, Fernand is drafted with the Royalists army that's fighting against Napoleon. He did not know what had happened to Dantes. Isn't that interesting? So we see that in varying degrees. So now we need to ask ourselves, why is, as the story unfolds and Dantes goes after Fernand, it's not because he was actively a part of the criminal of the thing that put him away. So you can look at 77 to verify that. He did not know exactly what had happened to Dantes. He was, though, in on the conversation that desired, of course, him to be certainly eliminated out of the way, not necessarily eliminated through death or imprisonment, but taken out of the way. He really has only had his eyes on Mercedes and his jealousy as another lover. But he did not know, so he was not active in the plot, per se. And again, I say he was drafted and gone, and Mercedes is left alone. And during that time, she grows in her affection for him, especially once she thinks that Edmond is dead. So she's concerned about both of them. She definitely loves Edmond, but when she thinks he's dead, her tenderness towards Fernand is growing while he's absent and also in danger. And finally, old Dante's, Edmond's father, dies 5 months later of grief. Monsieur Morel pays his funeral costs and the few debts that he has, which was courageous of him because he could have been considered just that act of doing anything in support of a Bonapartist would have been considered a crime. And now you are going to be tracing the stages of misery, but then we get a new prisoner or another prisoner. He's not new. I mean, he's been there longer, but he's finally connects with Edmond. His name then is Abbé, or kind of the monk, the abbey, okay? Abbé Faria, Faria. I think that might be how you pronounce it. And then you want to also look at their relationship and what the abbé contributes, how he helps in all the ways that he might be helping to the stability, the knowledge, the perspective, etc. Okay. Of Edmond. Okay. So review that. That would be a good kind of essay question there to consider and be able to describe in a paragraph or so. And then, of course, what he does is reveals the treasure. This is the treasure when he was that comes from the Spada family, the Caesar Spada. This is actually a very famous family in history in Italy. It is a centuries-old treasure. And he has the map that was hidden from so many eyes because it was invisible ink, and he had stumbled across it even though he had looked for it for years, okay? So let's see, probably the best quotes in my mind is on 84, the Faria asks him, who speaks of God and of despair in the same breath. Good quote. And the next quote, let me look for it here. Here it is on 86. Here near the bottom of the page it says, From this moment, Dante's happiness knew no bounds. He was not going to be alone anymore, and perhaps he might even gain his freedom. Anyway, even if he remained a prisoner, he would have a companion, and captivity shared with another is but half captivity. I think that's a powerful quote, speaking of our great need for companionship and to have others in our lives to share life with, but especially to share sorrow with. So it says again, captivity shared with another is but half captivity. So then, of course, you would want to make sure you knew the story of of what happens, why the Faria is not able to escape together, and how Dante's himself is able to escape. So that is pretty obvious, and I think you can make sure you know that part of the story by yourself. Okay? Now, the next section that I will talk about next time is how he remakes himself, some of the particulars with that, quickly remakes himself once he has escaped and into a new man, and then he is an agent of blessing, which you are assigned to write quick summaries on, as he is an agent of blessing to both Cadaris and Morel. And so you will want to know those parts of the story. And so we'll pick that up again next time.